Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, CBRS-Based MOCN Neutral Host, a game changer in enabling public and private cellular connectivity for businesses of all sizes, presented by Cox Private Networks. I'm Jenna D'Angelo, and I'll be moderating this webinar. I'd like to start off by introducing today's speakers. We have William Richmond, General Manager, Cox Private Networks, Joel Lindholm, CEO, co-founder of InfiniG, and Joe Madden, Principal Analyst, Mobile Experts Incorporated. You can read their full bios on the left side of your window by selecting the Speakers tab. Just a few notes before we begin. To access additional resources for today's presentation, please click the Handouts tab button on the left side of your screen. You can access closed captions from the bottom right corner of the video player. This webinar is being recorded and will be available to watch on demand within 24 hours. We'd love to hear from you. During the presentation, please submit any questions you have using the Questions and Answers tab on the left side of your screen. Time permitting, we will conclude with a Q&A session. Okay, let's begin. Joe, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Jenna, and welcome everyone to the webinar on neutral hosted private cellular. I know the official title has a lot of acronyms there, but what we're going to talk about today is how enterprises can get the benefits of private LTE or private 5G without becoming experts themselves in all those complexities of radio access and core networks and everything. You've probably heard about big enterprises like John Deere and Volkswagen setting up their own private LTE networks. You know, these are companies that have bought spectrum and hired hundreds of engineers to set up their networks, and then they have to staff a 24/7 operations center. So at the end of the day, you have a private network where people, you get the applications to work, but they still can't use their smartphone, and they've invested millions and millions. So we're here to talk about another solution where you can use private hosted cellular, which can be offered as a service to enterprises of all kinds. Now, my company is a market research outfit, and we've been studying this trend for the past 4 years. So I thought maybe I'd start off the webinar by just giving you some statistics on expected market development. So for example, in 2023, about 15% of the private wireless out there, the spending on private wireless by enterprise, used cellular technology, only 15%. The rest was Wi-Fi and Zigbee, Bluetooth, proprietary RF switches. But that 15% will become 30% in 2028, double the percentage of adoption in the industry, because many enterprises have recognized the higher reliability of a licensed cellular approach. And here's another one. In 2023, about 70% of the money spent on private cellular went into the CapEx bucket. So that's big companies buying their own equipment and sort of a DIY, do-it-yourself network. But by 2028, we expect that the service-based approach will grow tremendously, and that will become more than half of private cellular spending in 2028. So this market is growing fast. We see a $3.5 billion market today, but it will be more than $10 billion 5 years from now. So we're at the launch pad of a really exciting new market, and there's a lot for us to talk about. So let's hear from our two panelists. I'd like to get into it by asking our two panelists to introduce themselves and talk briefly about what their companies are doing. And William, let's start with you.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I'm William Richmond. I'm the general manager of the Private Networks division here at Cox Communications. We are focused on taking all of the sort of technologies that exist outside the traditional Wi-Fi purview of enterprise customers, and really focused on making them adoptable for our customers. And that can be all sorts of technologies, but seeing a lot of traction in recent years in the private cellular space, and really excited about sort of what the MOCN functionality means for private cellular adoption and just finding better ways to connect our customers.
Perfect. And Joel, can you introduce yourself and how InfiniG is related to Cox?
Yeah, hi. My name's Joel Lindholm. I'm CEO of a company called InfiniG. We are focused on providing something called neutral host as a service. As Joe mentioned, we believe that the direction that customers will be able to adopt cellular coverage is more as a service-based model. And so we're focused on solving this public cellular problem, and we'll talk about how it happens in correlation to private networks where people have their own kind of IoT devices. But yeah, we're focused on that, and we see a huge traction in the market. I think one of the biggest takeaways for people is that traditional models for gaining cellular coverage in buildings has not been scalable, and for pretty good reasons. We intend to bring the cellular coverage to the masses, so any building of any size can now go take advantage of it.
Super. Okay, and Joel, we'll stick with you for a minute. I'd love to hear some of the history of how your business grew up, and then let's get into some of the deployment stories of what you've done here with neutral hosted systems.
Yeah, no, it's perfect. Thanks, Joe. So I have a long history. Our team has a long history with CBRS. Originally, we were founding members back in 2016, 2017 timeframe of the CBRS Alliance. And so we were just looking to understand what can we do with this new spectrum. And for those those people out there not familiar with the spectrum, is the whole concept is to have wireless spectrum that was available for anybody to use, that it wasn't needing to be licensed to the carriers that had billions of dollars, and it wasn't wide open like Wi-Fi. And so we took this spectrum and said, hey, what can we go do with it? About at the beginning of 2020, myself and a few others from previous company came to Meta. And with Meta, we said, what can we do with this CBRS spectrum for our properties? And there's really two things that an enterprise like us could do. And one was use it for a private network for our own devices, or for public cellular coverage. And through a long evaluation process and innovation program, we determined that we could use this for public cellular coverage in our properties. Basically, we looked out and said the DAS systems, which we'll talk about, would only cover a quarter of the properties, but the rest of the properties were starved with coverage. We created this model that said the user's phones should just be able to work. So you don't have to deal with all the legacy fiddling with your phone to make a phone work in a building. Our employees demanded that we had consistent coverage through all the properties. And we knew that the MNOs had challenges coming into the properties with just budgets and how all the technology is deployed. So we innovated and created this model that said that we could use the CBRS spectrum across all the properties, solve all those challenges, solve Meta's problems as an enterprise. And that's what we looked after, is what could we do with our own properties and our own spectrum and our own networks. And how could we do it in a way that was friendly to everybody else? So yeah, we came up with this neutral host using shared spectrum, and realizing that it's a problem that's not existing just here in the US, but it's everywhere in the globe. So we came up with it and said, right, now how do we go take advantage of this? And that was the foundation of InfiniG. And in the early days, William and I got together, and him on the Cox side of the business, as also an innovator, said, how can we do something together here that benefits the companies and the industry?
Okay, that's fascinating. So good to have deep pockets behind the beginning stages of this, and now we have connections to customers. So, William, I wonder if you can.
Maybe I could add one more thing, Joe. Apologize, Joe. I forgot to add one thing. It didn't matter that we could do it for our properties, but we needed to let people know that this was a viable solution for the market to go and adopt. So we actually hosted a panel a year ago, almost to the day, at Mobile World Congress in Barcelona. I think we talked while we were out there, and the whole point of it was to let the industry know that this model was viable after 3 years plus worth of testing. And the panel I moderated also included AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile on stage to just expose to the industry that we had gone through all the efforts required to develop a solution and deploy a solution in our properties. And it was with participation and collaboration with the large MNOs in the United States. And so It was a huge proof point for us, and that was, again, after 3 years worth of development, almost a year ago now. So it's a huge thing.
Right. I remember that panel, and I agree. It's moved very quickly to having acceptance and participation by the big operators. So it is really moving along quickly. William, I'd love to hear your stories about how you've taken this technology to a couple of customers. I know there's some education customers and some healthcare customers. Let's hear some of the deployment stories from your point of view. How easy is this to put these things together?
Yeah, so I mean, our sort of charter as Cox Communications is finding better ways to connect our customers, and there's been sort of this stalemate in the industry for a long time where you know public cellular connectivity in facilities and buildings is not really a nice to have anymore. It's sort of a prerequisite to doing business, and so you know but there's the legacy type approaches to solving that are extremely time consuming to deploy. They're very very expensive. They're not typically synergistic with the existing infrastructure at customer sites, and so really excited about the opportunity to sort of build a better mousetrap here, and working with Joel and the team to come up with a way to do that based on the work that they did with Meta at some of our customers. And so we brought in Cancer Treatment Centers of America down in Phoenix, and a big healthcare facility, with an aging DAS type infrastructure that just didn't make any financial sense to do sort of a rip and replacement. Also have a lot of synergies with private cellular use cases on top of just the public cellular, and having an infrastructure that can solve for both use cases and that looks and feels and deploys like Wi-Fi was a big deal for them. Another great example is Arizona State University, where we have another project going with InfiniG that's live. And you think about a university campus, and you have hundreds of buildings on a university campus, and putting a DAS in all of them is just not viable, either financially or operationally. It just doesn't make a ton of sense. And with all of the LEED certified glass and different things coming into the building materials these days, the coverage is getting more and more difficult to achieve. So having a solution that is very surgical, very fast to deploy, and is exceptionally cost efficient, makes all the difference, and speaks to exactly what we're trying to do for our customers, right? And bringing all of the sort of connectivity mediums to bear in viable ways for enterprise.
And maybe
Okay,
Joe,
so
if
I
I could add
understand
on
that
to
these.
that, maybe
Go
Joe, if I
ahead.
could add on to that, when you looked at the deployments that William talked about, right, the fact that they had a legacy system that wasn't just meeting the needs of the people that were in the property, and you can think doctors and nurses in a hospital, it's important for them to be able to communicate with one another. At ASU, where you had kind of important people that are sitting there, whether it be the students or whether it be the administration, that actually need to communicate. They could not live with just a kind of best effort basis, which was the legacy model, whether it be because of the lead glass and the certification stuff from the outside world, or with a kind of legacy systems that just weren't giving that consistent coverage. That was a huge point for both of them to say, I know I need to spend money on something that can actually deliver the needs to the people that we're going to be using the network.
Okay, yeah, that's good. Now let's talk about what the deployment looks like. I mean, are we talking about months of engineering and planning and modeling and then installing, or are we talking about weeks, or how long does it take, and how much resource does it take to build out a campus, for example, at ASU?
So the physical side of the install is really really straightforward. One of the sort of compelling elements of this approach to extending public cellular is that for all intents and purposes, it looks and feels and deploys like Wi-Fi. These are PoE fed radios that run over existing Ethernet switches. They run out plain vanilla internet connections. So we're sort of bypassing the engineering cycles necessary when using licensed spectrum, the timelines associated with getting those on plan for the MNOs, right? The connections here are established once from the gateway to the mobile network operators, and then all subsequent deployments after that just go back to that same proxy interface. So extremely efficient to deploy and very synergistic with the kinds of infrastructures that enterprises operate today. And one of the, I would add, one of the big things that is really compelling to enterprise in this space is that it puts the coverage back in their sphere of control, right? So there is no longer this sort of dance or negotiation going on with the MNOs about where they can put coverage and trying to avoid conflicting with any sort of macro type environments. This is an entirely different spectrum. And so the enterprise has complete control over where and when and how that coverage is achieved.
Oh, that is unique. Okay. Now, Joel, let me ask you another question here. I've heard you guys talk about end-to-end deployment. Can you describe what that means when you talk about end-to-end and what these projects cover?
Yeah. So if you, and maybe it's taken a step back as well for the kind of the legacy models that I'll take a DAS as an example where it required commitment from the carriers to join a DAS, because if you look at the radios or whatever is transmitting in the building, we call it a small cell. It has to somehow connect all the way back to the carriers end to end, and so somebody has to look out after that connection, and you need to make sure that the connection's high quality, it's secure, it's going to meet the performance indications that the carriers care about. So somebody does have to look at this network end to end. And that's what we do is we look out and say, okay, we'll work with our partners like Cox to go and the designs and the installations and deploy it in these buildings. But then on an ongoing basis, we'll look after, monitor, and manage that network and provide all the network characteristics back to the carrier as well as to the enterprise for what the network's quality looks like. A lot of times that would have been hidden from the customer if they had deployed a DAS, because it was kind of a two-party system that the venue might have bought the DAS and the equipment that was going into the building, but the carrier was responsible for managing and operating the network on their side. And so it drove a lot of cost and complexity because of using the carrier signals, them bringing backhaul, them having to operate and monitor and manage a network. And so we look at that in its entirety for our business. So we are looking at the radios, we are looking at the signal sources, they call it, and the ongoing aspects of the network so that the carriers see that it's a high quality network to meeting their requirements for their regulatory obligations. And then the venue also has coverage in their building, and that's the expectation that they need for not only public coverage, but if they decide to use this in addition for private coverage as well for their own IoT devices. But that's the end-to-end view that we're looking after with our partners and our customers.
Okay, that's good. Now, William, now that we have some live deployments running, do you have any statistics on performance KPIs like reliability or data speeds or percentage of coverage or something like this we can hang our hat on?
Yeah, I mean, I would say sort of the most compelling statistic for us is that the people on site don't know the difference. Right, they come in and their phones work, and the throughput is exactly what they would expect outdoors and indoors, and there's continuity, and they hand off and they authenticate seamlessly, and the end user is absolutely none the wiser. They just know that they have great service. The feedback has all been very positive to date, and we're excited to continue building these out for our customers.
Yeah, that's great. So if the number of people calling in asking questions about it is zero, then you've succeeded. Yeah.
It's a no news is good news kind of an answer. And so, yes, while we look at the KPIs and we look at the throughputs and all those kinds of things to make sure that the network quality is there, the best measure is the fact that there's no complaints coming in.
Yeah. Okay. Now, Joel, you talked about DAS as one of the examples of other competing technologies, and DAS has been around for a long time. Um, we have a few questions coming in around what the typical cost is per square foot, and maybe a comparison of what would it cost per square foot for a DAS compared with this neutral hosted approach.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
can
there's
speak
a
to that.
go for it. Yep.
Yeah, so I can speak to that a bit. So, there's a little bit of nuance, sort of the floor plate for which you're covering, right? The radio density required in something like a hospital with fire breaks and lead lined walls is different than a big box retail store that's wide open. Um, what we've seen with our customers who have been in the market for a DAS or contemplating a DAS is that our solutions, both MOCN and private cellular, bolted on to facilitate operational use cases above and beyond just the public cellular, is typically in the neighborhood of 40 to 50% of the total cost of ownership of a DAS over the same lifetime. So pretty compelling sort of savings there. And you know, one of the challenges I think that we've seen in the private cellular network more broadly across the industry is it becomes very difficult to justify the spend for a private cellular network on a single use case or the group of use cases that exist today. But when we are able to put in an infrastructure that can serve both public and private cellular radio over the same infrastructure, that it changes the economic model for customers substantially and allows them to start pulling things into private cellular use cases sooner and without sort of the same obligations. So seeing a lot of traction in things like healthcare and higher ed, those are sort of layup verticals for this sort of technology, but also seeing a lot of stuff in like distribution and warehousing, even manufacturing, right? Highly reflective environments where mission critical use cases need to maintain connectivity and move around. Corrugated steel walls, insulation, refrigerated warehouses, things like that. And this solves both the safety element of being able to make a public cellular phone call while sort of facilitating those operational use cases that historically with a more traditional DAS type approach would typically be bifurcated systems.
And if I can add on one thing, Joe, right? Where I'm perfectly answered, as our partner going to market what the customers and the cost models are. I think the biggest overarching thing though is there's a massive category of customers that can't even get a DAS. So doing a comparison against something you just can't get is a huge thing. It's going to be lower cost, as William mentioned. That's not a problem. But if you're sitting in a 200,000 square foot building and you've got coverage problems, you're never going to get a DAS. The carriers have mentioned they're not going to go contribute. They're not going to bring their piece of the network. And so we do have a cost-effective solution for somebody that could have never gotten something in previously. And of the use cases that William talked about, where there's a lot of people out there that just need to make a 911 call from a safety perspective. There might be 10 users in a building, might be 100 users in a building. You're never going to justify the business case to the carriers to go do that, but yet they still need to make that call. And so we now have a capability of bringing it to those masses that just weren't viable before.
Yeah, you make a good point there, Joel, is that it's not just the total cost, but who pays, right? In the case of a DAS, the operator has to provide the signal source, and nobody can do that for them. So they have to come up with a radio and bring that radio to the field. And in your case, all the operator has to do is allow you to connect to their core, which from a cost point of view is zero or minimal.
And it gives them a network that they've tested, they've certified through our collaboration with them. They know that when we put up a venue, that it's going to have a high quality service in that venue. We're going to design the network to the standards that the carriers expect, so that when somebody who's walking around the venue, they know that their phone's going to work. And if they do need to make a security related call, it's going to go through. You can't say that about I'll say the systems that take the service over the air, because you have no idea whether the capacity's there, whether the network's going to be there or not. And so by being able to bring a high quality network into the building that the carriers have tested and certified and delivers their services gives them a huge comfort on being able to serve these properties where subscribers weren't able to serve before or weren't able to get coverage before.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let me
Yeah,
ask you another question, because I think that the three of us have been in the industry for a while, and we probably know this at a gut level, but other people may not be aware of why would we do this technology now, and what's changed in the world that allows us to do this sort of neutral hosted small cell approach now. Um, William, any thoughts about that?
yeah. So I think there's several sort of macroeconomic factors happening here, right? So our reliance on our mobile device to do every facet of our life is continuing to grow, right? There's all sorts of publications from the MNOs about the wild capacity increases and the growth in capacity CAGRs over the years. So, that's a problem. That's a physics problem, right? The whole premise of putting small cells on street corners was to get the radios closer to the end users so that the end users share a larger piece of the pie. Um, well, same holds true inside a building, right? We have to move the radios closer to the end users to increase the capacity or increase the share of that radio per user. Um, the only way to do that, right, is to find an economical way for building owners to be able to invest in that sort of infrastructure. The subscriber base of the MNOs is not growing, and so the revenues can't justify further capital expenditures into customer facilities. The customers need it, and so we've been in this sort of stalemate for years of I can't justify paying for a traditional architectural system like a DAS, right? But I need the coverage, and the MNOs aren't paying for it. So what do I do? And so, this is the MOCN model is not really a new model. The technology has been around for a very long time. It's really a new muscle in the U.S. sort of ecosystem in the way that the U.S. MNOs think about it. This is a business problem at this point. This is not a technical problem. The technical sort of capabilities and aptitude of this architecture have worked and continue to work across the world. It's just new for us here in the U.S.
Yeah, good stuff. Okay. Well, let's move on to some talking about these verticals. You mentioned the education vertical and the healthcare vertical. Why are these the popular early cases? Why are these the ones that you've chosen to focus on for now? And what needs to happen for other verticals like retail or manufacturing to come along?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say that we are seeing demand for this across virtually every single vertical. There's about 90%, 85%, 90% of the market that just don't have dedicated in-building coverage solutions and need it. Um, the tier one NFL stadiums and tier one airports are sort of a no brainer for the traditional architectures because the carriers will invest, they'll prioritize them. But for the rest of the market, they've been somewhat SOL. And so we are seeing this from education to healthcare to hospitality to factories and warehouses, mixed use development, all sorts of different things. This is not a unique need to any specific vertical. Um, Obviously, some verticals are primed to move a little bit faster because of some of the synergies around the private cellular use cases, right? You think automation in warehouses and manufacturing facilities and having sort of a dual purpose 911 capable type network, but also the operational components of a private cellular network. Um, you know, Very different sort of rationale for a higher education system where it's really about finding a more economic way to extend the coverage. I mean, students aren't um, students don't fill out Scantrons for tests anymore. They answer quizzes on their phones now in class, right? So
Really?
this is not a nice to have. This is a must have. Doctors in a hospital, perfect example, right? Today, doctors in hospitals share the same Wi-Fi network as the patients sitting in bed streaming Netflix and have no ability to prioritize their use cases over anybody else's, right? Perfect solution, right? A public cellular solution that provides 911 and continuity for the patrons in the hospital, but also gives a dedicated slice for the doctors to be able to do what they need to do and have a quality of service protected from the rest. So we are really seeing this all over the place.
Okay, good stuff. Yeah, any technical thoughts on that question, Joel? I mean, as far as something like manufacturing where they need low latency or they want that slice for some kind of must not fail application in a manufacturing plant, is the technology there for those kind of things?
Yeah, I think you have to separate the use cases, that those private use cases where they do require that ultra low latency or low latency, I'll just say, versus the public cellular coverage, which is more latency flexible, frankly. The horizontal use case is, as William mentioned, right, is people want to use their phone or they need to use their phone. And that is sensitive to being able to have good coverage and a good latency, not crazy extreme latency, but that's what they need. And so solving that problem is one barrier. Um, the latency required for the applications and the doctors and the nurses is different than what's going to be required for a robot or something that's in an industrial type use case. So um, by the approach we're taking with the small cells, we're able to go in and optimize the coverage for that particular venue. So I'll take some sort of a I don't know, conference area. We can densify the network into that area so that we put more capacity for those people that are in that area. Or if you are in a factory, then if we need to, we can densify it so the performance and the latency is going to meet whatever the private network needs, if they so choose to add the private network layer on top of it. So we do have a lot of flexibility because we do have the spectrum that's available, and we also have design aspects that we can take into consideration. Again, the legacy models, you would be bringing in spectrum into a building and sharing it across the building, or you'd be relegated to whatever's happening outside the building that they take off the air to bring into the building. And so many of these customers can't appreciate the fact that I have a network that I can go use. And there's a little bit like everybody's dependent on their cell phone. Like that's their need, but they're also relegated to, oh, I just walk to the building or I'll go outside in order to get a cell. Like, how is that possible? Like in my world, like in our age groups here, probably like, God-given dial tone. Everybody had rights to dial tone. Your phone line needed to go work. And somehow we've slipped to, well, maybe my phone works, or can I call you back? Like, that's just unacceptable. And the fact that we have spectrum, we have a technology that's available that can work seamlessly with the network outside and now bring it inside.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I've talked with the CTO of one of the major nationwide healthcare systems. I don't think I can name them here, but he said pretty much the same thing. That what they really care about is nurses and doctors texting and calling each other and being able to get through all the time. And it's not this crazy application. It's not robotic surgery that they're trying
Nope.
to do. It's really just having a slice that they can count on and know that it works in every room. And that's something that they've been unable to achieve with Wi-Fi and unable to get with public services.
And the verticals have to understand that from the beginning. If I choose this path, I'm going on license bands with the carriers solving that problem. I'm now locked into that direction. Or if I'm spending my money and I'm going over the air, I'm going in that direction. This gives customers the ability to say, hey, I'm going to start with this high quality voice network, and then I'm going to evolve it on my time to go add on these other applications. Like the doctors and nurses the hospitals aren't all of a sudden going to come and say, here's the 50 applications I'm going to put on a private network. they're still trying to figure out what a private network is. Meanwhile, they're stepping over the huge problem, which is coverage. Let the doctors and nurses talk. And then over time, start layering on these other applications with this network we're able to share with them. And it becomes their network. But they need to make that decision at the beginning when they choose to go, which direction they choose to go. This gives them the most flexibility for the future and whatever their future applications are.
Yeah, I would add one point that I think is sort of important here, right? In a license spectrum approach, um, there is very little sphere of control for the enterprises, right? They don't really get to control what's covered, um, to what capacity or how many sectors or even timelines, right? Like it could be 6 months, it could be 2 years before a carrier joins the network if they join the network. So they really have no sort of control over that construct. Um, in this scenario, we are using a unlicensed spectrum or a lightly licensed spectrum in CBRS that is completely different than what is being used outside by the carriers. And so the customer has complete autonomy over when they cover, what they cover, how they cover, right? And that changes that dynamic, right? The conjecture about whether or not a carrier is going to participate this year, next year, at all, that's gone, right? Because the connection is established once from the outset, and that connection is pre-established.
That's true, and I think also what you find is that in emergency situations, God forbid an earthquake hits here in California, the public network will be completely swamped. And if you're on independent spectrum, that seems to be a big plus in the hospital. Well, let's move on to the next question. I think people may be wondering, why is it important to work with a larger tier one company like Cox? If this is a simple product now that works on shared spectrum, you theoretically could just buy a router like you do with Wi-Fi, put it in yourself. But William, maybe you can explain why is it important to work with a tier one provider, and what does Cox bring to the party here?
Yeah, so I mean, these are vectors into the mobile network operators' networks, right, in their core networks, and these are not things that they take lightly. And so, um, you know, they're they require a vetted professional experienced team to be able to do that. They're not just going to let anybody do that. These are also big systems. These are complex technologies. Joel and the team make it look easy, but there is a lot that goes into the back end of this, right? And so everything from registering the radio locations for 911 services and things like that, there's a lot of work that goes into the back end of this, and not something that can be taken lightly. It takes a large team with dedicated field services and knocks and all of the right sort of operational processes in place to make sure that they run smoothly, right? Our customers are not buying hardware from us; they're buying a turnkey deliverable from us, and it really takes a village to be able to do that.
I'm going to
I'm
add on a
thinking.
little bit of color to our good partner Cox here. I think William's being a little humble on some of this. If you're a university that has 20, 40, 50 buildings, if you're a retailer that has 500 stores or 1,000 stores nationwide, right? You want to come to somebody like a Cox that can come and deliver it at scale. Look at the hospitality teams. There's, they have how many properties across the country, but you want somebody, I believe that you want somebody like a Cox that can come in and say, hey, I can take care of those needs and I can scale with you as you grow. This is not a legacy view of a building by building one-off problem. This is and that's the way we looked at it. I'll bring back to our meta days, is we wanted consistency across every one of our properties. We wanted to make sure that whenever the employees came in the building, they knew their phones would work. And with an ever growing mobile workforce, you needed to make sure it's a video call or voice call or whatever it is, that we had the consistency across the country. And so I think people like Cox, partners like Cox, had the ability to go and bring it to a scale at that level for big customers and big verticals.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think even if it was possible to hire those people, if I'm a mid-sized enterprise like a hospital or a university, uh, maybe I could go out and hire those people. I think it's a little doubtful. But even then, you don't get the credibility to get the partnerships with the big operators. So very
And I think
important.
that
The key here, right, is consistency. So these networks have to be run according to ITIL best practices, and security patches are not optional, right? This has to happen. Um, there is a ton of work that has to be done, to help educate customers around sort of, how you know how we go into that ecosystem, right? And so you need teams that are adept at that literally do that day in and day out across the enterprise. And so, that's where the network as a service really comes into play, right? Um, you know, there are larger obligations around making sure that the networks are reliable and fully functional all the time, and kept to sort of the best practices that frankly don't scale down to an enterprise IT team. It's a very sort of focused area of expertise.
And I'll add on
Okay.
to that from an operator perspective. When part of the complexity is when a mobile operator looks, their job is putting up a macro network, like that's their job. So all our phones work across the globe or across the country. Um, a building is a hard thing. It's like one off versus a consistent view. And there's a lot of complexity that goes into that, so that and our focus is making sure we're deploying networks that are both meeting the needs and the consistency from a carrier perspective, as well as the one-off needs and the flexibility for the venues perspective. And so there's a lot that goes into that it's really hard to justify, if you're an enterprise, to build your own network, if you will, that has all the longevity and the life cycle and the consistency and frankly the liabilities that come with delivering a 911 service to somebody. Like that's a really hard thing for an enterprise. Thankfully we were a dedicated innovation team that were able to go through at Meta to go through and work on that with the carriers. It's really, really hard for somebody to have that kind of depth and breadth to go do that by themselves. And so our view is that while we can sit in the middle, look at the carriers one way, look at the enterprises another way, and give the flexibility and meet the needs of both of them. And it's a lot more than just taking a couple parts and putting it together. There's a ton that goes underneath the coverage to actually operate a network like this and operate at consistency amongst those guidelines. And so it's, again, way more than I think an individual enterprise could typically digest.
Yeah, I think that's right. And like you say, no one cookie cutter solution fits everyone. I want to expand on what you just talked about, Joel, with the one-off solutions. And I wonder if you can maybe give some examples from your deployment so far on where plain vanilla wasn't quite enough and you had to do something extra. Maybe more details about how 911 works, or some push-to-talk functionality that you enable, or IoT enable, or something like that. Can you give some examples of customization that you've done?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer it kind of two ways. On the neutral host aspect of it, our explicit approach is to not make it unique, right? Because again, you need that consistency. The M&O needs to look out and say, hey, every building is done the same way, right? I may use more radios here, fewer radios there, but at the end of the day, the way we connect to the carriers and the response of the network and the quality of the network has to be the same. And so, so we actually drive towards consistency, to make sure that that is a very repeatable solution. It gives comfort on both sides. Where the uniqueness has come into play is going to be by the applications that they choose to use on the private network or not. And so that's where the Coxes of the world come in to talk to the customers and say, hey, if it's just voice you're solving, here's your solution. If it's some low capacity basic IoT devices. Well, here's a SIM card and how I can deploy something for you with that, versus designing something that's unique to that particular customer and vertical to go deeper into the private network side of the world that is very personal to them. So that's how we bridge the we're doing things very consistently from a carrier perspective, and our partners are able to go and actually design something and deploy it uniquely for the customer. And so, the hospital is different than, and their applications are in fact different than what a university's applications are. And so, they can customize that network for them all day long.
Yeah, I mean
Yeah.
that's sort of the art and the science, right? Is having having a highly complex private cellular network running over the same infrastructure that a a very normalized and repeatable public cellular experience is run over. That's the nuance that's really tough, and that's where enterprises need that subject matter expertise to be in their corner.
Great. Okay, well, I think we've covered one of our last topics, which was sort of the comparison of private LTE and neutral host. And William, you did a good job of talking about how you get both, and the ROI for the enterprise really is much better because you get both the public coverage and the private LTE at the same time. Any thoughts to expand on that theme there?
No, I mean this. When CBRS came out and Cox started working on the private network stuff, we thought from the outset that MOCN Neutral Host was going to be a catalyst for private cellular adoption in the U.S. because of all of those synergies, and so really excited to see that coming to fruition, and that sort of double punch value proposition is really resonating for our customers.
Sounds good. Okay, so we'll sort of short circuit that last question, and let's go right into. We have 7 pages of questions from all the viewers online, so lots of interest out there. And maybe you guys see this. I've been highlighting some of them as high priority here. So I'm going to start off with one. How seamless is the handover from public to private and private to public? And I think this there's maybe that's not quite the right terminology in the question. I think what he's asking is how seamless is the handover from the MOCN radio channel to the public radio channel?
Yeah, so I'll answer that. I guess the being that when we created this model, we said, look, right, carriers, like there's a way that you have to share common infrastructure, and so there's some technical things that are required, like that one radio needs to broadcast multiple different carriers and the phones, and when you build a shareable entity, then we had to do some certain things and create some things from an industry perspective so that it can be shareable. What also happens is now that each of the carriers has to also coordinate with that same infrastructure. So we worked, I'll just say, with the carriers, all 3 carriers across the country, to say, hey, there's a consistent way of doing this. And we have to coordinate it with how they build their macro networks. And we're building these neutral host networks so that the 2 recognize each other. And so when we go and actually deploy a new building, we do that in a coordinated way with the carriers to make sure that because they're adjacent with one another, that a mobile phone will know I'm leaving the macro network and coming into a neutral host network in the building, so that you can have that seamless hand out and hand in from the mobile's perspective. Frankly, one of our problems was when people were coming in and out of the building and going from the macro network to Wi-Fi, they're dropping calls, and the inconsistency of performance was awful. And so it's important that I'll call it doctors triaging a patient as they're walking from their car into the building. You cannot afford to have that call drop, and so the way we accomplish that is by coordinating the mobile operators network with our network for that seamless hand out and hand in. From a private device perspective, that's different, right? Now it's a separate network that's done inside the building, And there are technologies that can be applied for doing that, but they're not for the faint of heart, I'll say at this point in time. So we kind of separate that out to say, hey, if you're a private device, that's private to the enterprise. You're a public device, that is a publicly available device. There are ways of mixing and matching in between. I think Cox is working on some of that stuff, as well as some other folks in the industry, to make it more seamless. But it's very specific about how you would implement it in order to make that successful.
Yeah. So
Okay.
there was one question here about the SIMs that I think
Yes.
parlays with that. So just a point of clarification. So for a MOCN neutral host connection, for a public cellular connection, there is nothing that the end user does differently. They walk in, their phone's hands over, and they are continuing to operate as normal. They have no idea that anything has changed. On a private cellular network, we provision a private cellular SIM for those devices. So in the case of the university or the hospital, right, for the public cellular connectivity, there is no SIM going out to the end users. They just come in and use it and they're off and running. On a private cellular side, we actually provide a private cellular SIM that can be put in the device either virtually or physically as a secondary SIM or a primary SIM, and there are algorithms and things that we can do on the devices to actually determine when to connect to each for things like private cellular use cases. So
Good stuff. Okay, so here's another question. How do you get the mobile operators to agree to do this? And I can tell you from my experience, some of the operators take the approach that if a user's got a phone on my service, I don't want anyone else to handle that service because I want to control to give them the best experience. So how do you get the operators past that hurdle?
Yeah, I'll start, and William, you can add if you want. It's I think control is a big point of that. And so, as you mentioned, Joe, if you have no coverage in the building, what kind of control do you have? Right, there is no control. Like that's a big piece of it. If there's a legacy mentality that's I'm used to designing a DAS and I'm bringing in my signals and I'm putting in a large public venue or a venue that's big enough to go deploy, that justifies the cost, right? When you dip below that and there is no coverage, you don't really have much control, right? The user could be very well out of service. And so from that perspective, if the venue, I care about my hospital, I care about my office, I care about my building, and you look at it from a venue's perspective, they say, I need coverage, and they're willing to pay for coverage. And so that means they're missing it, in which case it should be an obvious signal to the carriers to say, I need to go join this network. And so the carriers that are participating, they recognize that fact that my customer says I need coverage, I'm going to go join that coverage. If the barrier is low enough, like you don't have to bring your signals, you don't have to do all the planning, you don't have to invest all the money into it, then why would you not join that particular venue? And I think it does start with the customer's perspective, right? The legacy view was, I'm going to go take a carrier or maybe two carriers. I think the average numbers of people joining a DAS are like 1.44 MNOs because they make business decisions on whether to join or not. In this model, the customer has the ability to say, I want multiple carriers participating, and I've lowered the barrier entry and I'm paying for it. It's a completely different perspective than what the legacy models have been, where it was only tailored to the largest buildings that could justify the investment.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Well, okay, so William, can you tell me about which operators are participating so far, and how's that going in getting the operators to sign up?
Yeah, so I think there's somewhat of a precedent for this sort of stuff. When you look at things like Passpoint and Wi-Fi offload, right? Wi-Fi does some things well. It does not handle voice calls and things like this well. And so, sort of been a Band-Aid solution. But just like in Wi-Fi offload, not the carriers are not going to go and join everybody that has a Wi-Fi network and turns Passpoint on. That's just not viable. They are not going to subject their subscribers to unvetted, right, or unqualified networks, and very much the same here, right? So the carriers are only going to make connections to providers that they feel like can represent them in a good fashion and provide high quality of service to their end subscribers. So it's a little more complex there. AT&T and T-Mobile are very much on board with this technology. They understand the implications of being able to service their customers, wherever they need to, and they fully understand that the economics of that have to work. Verizon, has obviously done this. It's technically been proven, right? It's now just a matter of whether or not, sort of what their timeline looks like, right? We don't believe that there's any scenario where, two of the carriers participate and one does not. It just that lends itself to some pretty substantial disadvantages from an economic standpoint. So we see it coming. The biggest challenge that the MNOs have is again, not technical, but more building the business process to ingest these sorts of projects coming in, right? Because we're talking about 80% of the market that is now, in play for a solution. And how do you think about building programs to catch those sort of inbound projects and inbound network connections? So, Verizon is a little bit more conservative around that and always have been. So we expect them to participate in the not too distant future. But today, AT&T and T-Mobile are ready to go and super excited about this stuff.
Okay, sounds good. Now, one clarification on the SIM question, William. You mentioned there's no change at all needed for a phone to have access to a public network on the neutral hosted system. But if you're going to do something special with, push to talk or with something in a private network inside the building on your own private slice, do you need a separate SIM card or a dual SIM phone?
Yeah, so something like that, like a doctor, for example, right? We could give the doctor in a hospital a secondary SIM, a virtual SIM that's just a QR code that they scan and put on their device. And then we can set the prioritizations on the device to say, when you're within range of this network, use the private side. When you leave the scope of the private network, switch back over to the public on your other SIM card. And so perfect application for a hospital.
Okay, maybe one quick last question. I have one here. Is it possible to deploy this anywhere? Are there any keep out zones for the operators, or any issues with going outdoors with this system, or anything like that?
Yeah, the majority of the deployments. The majority of the deployments today are indoors. The handoff between the macro and the indoor environment is a little bit easier to manage in the early innings. I think longer term we'll see more convergence between indoor and outdoor, and some of the carriers are a little bit more receptive to outdoor than others. But the easiest place to start is indoors, and there's plenty of wood to chop in the indoor space. So that's where our focus is right now.
Super. Well, guys, thank you. I think we're out of time, so I'm going to hand it back to Jenna for a wrap up. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you for attending this Fierce Wireless webinar and submitting so many great questions. I'd like to thank our speakers for participating and Cox Private Networks for presenting today's webinar. A recorded version of this webinar will be available for you to access within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at a future event.